SANDHAN, All Gujarat Integrated Classroom.
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.
Good morning, my dear students, and welcome to an hour-long lecture on comedy as a literary form. I'm sure all of you are aware that when we think of drama, we think of two major divisions. We think of tragedy and we think of comedy. And all of you know that much before the other forms of literature came into effect, we had the comedy and the tragedy. Drama was one of the most ancient, along with poetry, one of the most ancient forms of literature all over the world. Not merely in England, where it came much later, but all over the world. What do we mean by comedy? We say it is a way of looking at the world in which basic values are associated, but natural laws are suspended to underscore human follies and foolishness. Do understand, what creates laughter, my dear students? It's always somebody's folly, somebody's flaw, somebody's defect, somebody's foible. This is what creates laughter. And of course, it can be foolishness also. When you find people doing things which are very odd, which are obviously stupid, which are unintelligent, then one feels like laughing. And this laughter could be wry, could be a very funny kind of humor, could be hilarious where you want to laugh your heart out. And it could be rueful. Rueful, my dear students, means, where there's a little element of sorrow, sadness that this happened, but you're still laughing. It's like when you find somebody slipping and maybe falling, there is a bit of laughter, but with a little bit of sorrow, sadness that maybe the person could have got hurt. It is a genre. I want you to notice that the word, because it's a French word, is pronounced genre. And genre means literary form. We use the word literary form, but the more technical word is genre. Now, it's a genre of dramatic literature. As I just mentioned at the beginning, we generally divide drama into tragedy and comedy. And of course, you can have many more. Like you can have melodrama, you can have historical plays. But if you have to divide it into two simple ones, then it would be tragedy and comedy. So it is a form of dramatic literature that deals with the light and amusing. Or it could even deal with the serious and the profound. But what is important is the manner in which it is done. And what is the manner? It's a light, familiar, or satirical manner. You get that? What the topic is, what the theme is only one part of the comedy. The more important thing is, how is it being dealt with? To attempt to define any form of literature, in fact, to attempt to define anything is very difficult. That is true of literature. That is true of also all the forms of literature. So when we attempt to define comedy as a literary form, I thought I'll give you an idea of what different ages felt about comedy as a literary form. Let me take you to the Elizabethan age. And of course, you know Sir Philip Sidney. You know that we consider him a poet, but you also know that we think of him as a critic. All of us remember his great reply to Gausson's criticism of poetry. We remember his work called The Defense of Poetry. Poesy, as it was called in those days, poetry, as we call it today. He says, comedy is an imitation of the common errors of our life. Every human being, when he watches a comedy, when he reads a comedy, he does think of how this error has been seen earlier. It's not something unusual. It's not something that has never happened before or will never happen again. It is a common error of life. Our lives, that means we can easily relate to it. And remember, all literature is an imitation of life, of reality. So Sir Philip Sidney, the important writer of the Elizabethan age, attempts to define comedy as an imitation of the common errors of our life. What does Horace Walpole say many years later? he tries to understand comedy and tragedy and the contrast between the two. So what does he say? The world is a comedy to those that think and a tragedy to those that feel. So according to him, emotions are more important in a tragedy and thinking is more important. That does not mean that comedy is a more intellectual form of drama. It only means that there is less appeal to the emotions in a comedy than there is in a tragedy. Let's come to something which is much, much lighter, and which is by Lord Byron, the famous romantic poet. And what does he have to say? He says, all tragedies are finished by a death. I think we would agree with that. We only have to think of all the great Shakespearean tragedies with which you are familiar. You have to think of Hamlet and Macbeth and Othello and King Lear and the entire list. And what happens at the end of a tragedy? It finishes in a death. And generally, the death of the protagonist, the death of the hero, the death of the important character. And we notice that when we use the word tragedy, we immediately assume that it should end in death, because that is the greatest tragedy that is shown in any literature. And what happens to comedy? How does the comedy end? He says it very well when he says comedy should end in a marriage. Comedy should end in a marriage is what he says. All's well that ends well, right? And they lived happily ever after. You think of the fairy tale endings and then you feel, yes, the comedy. This is what the comedy is all about. When and where did comedy as a dramatic form, as a literary form begin? My dear students, I'm sure, as students of English literature, you're all aware that when we talk of the beginnings, we have Chaucer, but that's not where literature began. And so we go to Europe and we go to European literature. And when we go to European literature, the earliest beginnings are always in Greece or in Rome, more in Greece than in Rome. Think of the first critic that you know. Think of Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, and you will know what I'm talking about. We have to go to Greece. And what is the word which gave birth to the English word comedy? It's a Greek word. The Greek word komos, K-O-M-O-S. It was actually a celebration in the village, a village revelry, and usually a feast to the wine god Dionysus. What happens? A group of villagers get together. They are in a happy mood. They sing and dance after having a little bit of wine. And that is komos. From commerce, we gradually moved on to the English word comedy. If I have to talk to you about the beginnings of comedy, and if I'm telling you that it all began in Greece with a small village revelry, I cannot but draw your attention to the major writers of that period. That period is about 2000 years ago, more than 2000 years ago, my dear students. We are thinking of a period when already there was drama, there was comedy in Greece, much, much before English literature began. We have to go to that period because it is from there that the literary form that today we call comedy arrived in England. So let's go to the earliest beginning and try and think of some of the writers, some of the names: Aristophanes, Menander, Plautus, Terence. Now these are the important comedy writers that we think of. And when we think of these comedy writers, the tragedy writer Seneca immediately comes to mind because we talk of Senecan tragedy. But today, of course, I'm going to talk to you about comedy. So let's talk about the kind of comedies that these people wrote. We're talking of Aristophanes and Menander, and we're talking about Plautus and Terence. We could say that they had action comedies. They had comedies which ridiculed and satirized. They also had that kind of comedy which later gave birth to what we call the comedy of manners, about which I'm going to talk to you when we talk about Restoration comedy. But that will come later. So, we are right at the beginning of comedy, which was in Greece, where you had writers like Aristophanes and Menander and Plautus and Terence, the early beginnings. From there, let's move to England. And the period that I'm talking about now is the 14th century, the 15th century. Remember, we are trying to see how comedy reached the form in which we understand comedy as a part of drama, as a kind of dramatic literature, as a genre of drama. And then we come now to the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, England. I want you to understand that at this period, we had different kinds of plays. The kind of drama that we know today had not yet been born in England. So what did we see then? We had the moralities, the mystery plays, the miracles, and the interludes. My dear students, I'm talking about the beginning of drama, of comedy as we know it today. So what were these plays? These were performed by small groups of people. Actually, they had a wagon and they would take it from place to place. These were performed by the guilds. That is, you would have a group of carpenters maybe performing. You would have a group of other kinds of workmen, shoemakers, cobblers. You would have different kinds of people, groups within their guilds. And they would move from one area to another. Something like the street plays of today, which appeals to the people who have just collected round a crowd on the road, on the street, and they enjoy that. So these plays in those days were like that. What did they do? They had a particular idea, a particular value, a particular virtue, which they wanted to highlight. And these were the moralities. Then we move on to the mystery plays and the miracle plays, which were actually from the stories from the Bible. Stories which were well known to the people who were watching the play. But at the same time, it held their interest because of the way in which it was being staged. Even to use the word stage, my dear students, is wrong because there was no stage. As I told you, it would probably be a cart, and they would stand on the cart and they would perform, and the cart would go from place to place. Around the same time, you have another kind of drama which is called the interlude. You know the English word interval, right? Between two acts, you could have an interval. You're watching a movie, there is an interval between the first half of the movie and the second half of the movie. Now the interlude is something like that. It is a very short play which is performed either before the main play or between two acts of the main play. Later, the one-act plays developed from the interludes, but that is not our topic today. But remember, a beautiful one-act play like Monkey's Paw was once written as an interlude, but the play was such a success that it gradually became the main play. There are many one-act plays like that, but that's much later. That's the 20th century, and I'm still with you in the 14th and 15th century. We have still not reached Elizabethan drama. We have not yet reached the Renaissance. I'm talking before that. It is that at that period that the moralities, the miracle plays, the mystery plays, and the interludes were very much in fashion. Performed by a small group of people, as I told you, by guilds, probably with very little stage, makeup, costume, etc. But they had good dialogue delivery. And the topics, the themes that they were dealing with were what the common man understood. And that is why they were great success. Let us move on now to the Renaissance. Remember that whenever we talk about English literature, whenever we talk about the growth of English literature, we begin by talking about the Renaissance, because this was the revival of learning. After 1,000 years that we call the Dark Ages, from the 4th century to the 14th century, once again there was an awakening. Students of literature have to remember words like Renaissance and Reformation, because we see directly or indirectly the effect of these two major movements in Europe in the literature that we study, in English literature in particular. There are two comedies which are referred to. You would never be studying them, but probably you will be looking at them as an acquaintance factor when you look at what's happening in the beginnings of comedy in English language. Because remember, we began with Greek, and now I've come to England, and I'm talking to you about what was happening in the Renaissance period. At that stage, we have two important plays that we generally talk about, and that is Ralph Roister Doister and Gamma Gurton's Needle. Simple plays, but plays which would make you smile, plays which would make you laugh, plays which will take you to the age in which it was written. Because remember, drama is always a representation of the age in which it is written. So we get quaint pictures of the kind of life that Englishmen lived in those times. And from there, it is one big leap to Elizabethan drama. No student of literature can ever say she does not know what Elizabethan drama is all about. Because one of the greatest playwrights of the entire world, one of the greatest playwrights of all times, lived and wrote in this period. Of course, I'm talking about William Shakespeare, the Bard of Avon. But I'll talk about his plays later. Before that, very quickly, let's see what was Elizabethan drama all about. Remember, you had the university wits. Remember, you had Kidd and Marlowe and Johnson, who used to make fun of Shakespeare because he didn't even have a school education. Forget a university education. And later critics referred to these people as the university wits, referred to in a slightly sarcastic way, in a slightly ironic way, because this school dropout later became one of the greatest playwrights of all time, William Shakespeare. I want to make a passing reference here, my dear students, to Sanskrit drama. I'm talking about comedy. I'm talking about comedy as a literary form. I'm talking about English literature. But I cannot but mention what was happening in Sanskrit drama in the early years, in the early centuries AD. What was the kind of drama that was being written here? It's very intriguing. It's very interesting to note that Sanskrit drama does not have any tragedy, the way we understand tragedy in English drama, in English literature, in European literature. What do I mean by that? I mean that the Sanskrit plays did not end with the death of the hero, because all plays ended what we would call a feeling of shant. Yes, there are tragic moments. Think of the great plays of Kalidasa. When Dushyanta doesn't recognize Shakuntala, it is certainly tragedy. But it is tragic, but it is not tragedy in the sense in which we understand tragedy as students of English literature. It's interesting for you to, at your own pace, in your free time, wonder why Sanskrit drama does not have tragedy the way English literature has tragedy as a form. Let's now move on to the concept of comedy, high and low comedy. You know, when you watch a movie, there could be places where you laugh, but you think it's a very low kind of laughter. And there could be places where you really enjoy it because you think it's very intellectual. It is comedy, but it's very intellectual. So also, when we talk about comedy as a literary form, we must distinguish between high and low comedy. What do I mean by high comedy and low comedy? I've tried to project it like a ladder. You start walking and you gradually reach the top. I'm trying to project it like that. And I would say at the top, you have what is called pure comedy. You have what is called high comedy. Now, this kind of comedy could be what we call the Juvenalian. Juvenal was a famous Latin writer. The kind of comedy that he had was biting humor. That means it was like a slash of the whip. It means that the comedy was there, but the comedy was created by satire. He wanted to probably laugh at the follies, but he did not laugh at it in a very good-humored way. That is one kind of comedy where the satire is biting. It hits you. It's like a whiplash. It's like a sword piercing you, but it still is comedy. This could be a highly complex kind of comedy. It could have intellectual, or it could even be slapstick, which comes through surprise, which comes through incongruity. A difficult word, but I'm sure you can look up the meaning when you have the time. But incongruous is the coexistence of two things which really should not be together. So it's a very incongruous kind of situation. It could also be caused by out of place verbal wit. If an uneducated, illiterate person attempts to speak like a great scholar, we would call it out of place verbal wit. And this can cause great comedy. Later I'm going to talk to you about Mrs. Malaprop and malapropism in comedy as a form of evoking laughter. On the other extreme, we have what is called low comedy. And this comes by misunderstandings, mistaken identities. It depends on action. It depends on situation. And most of the time, the themes are very trivial. Themes are very petty. Themes are very unimportant. So that is on the lower side, the lower rungs of the ladder of comedy. It could be farce, and I'm going to talk to you about farce later. It could be occurrences which are embarrassing. It could be something very simple, which is very common in the comedy of manners, where you're talking about somebody and criticizing him, and he's at the door listening to all of that. So it could be a very embarrassing occurrence, or it could be an inopportune arrival. This is the distinction between high and low comedy. And even in literature, we do have both kinds of comedy. What are the methods which writers use to evoke comedy? It's important because you want the audience to laugh. What is the method that you can use? I would like to quote for you something that Aristotle said. Imitation of bad characters, bad not with respect to every sort of vice, but to ridicule only, as being a species of turpitude or deformity. This is neither painful nor destructive. Remember, in comedy, we laugh, but the person we laugh at is not filled with vice. If you can distinguish between vice and virtue very simply, he need not be a very virtuous person. But when we say bad, it is an exaggerated kind of. It's not bad in the sense that a villain in a tragedy is bad. You must remember that in comedy there are no extreme bad characters, just like there are no extreme good characters. The kind of hero that we talk about in tragedy would probably never be there in a comedy. What else does the dramatist do in order to evoke comedy? In order to get the comic element, one important thing is to have a happy ending. All of us go back saying God's in his heaven, all's right with the world. Along with Browning, this is what we would like to say at the end of a comedy. Everybody is happy, everybody goes home. You need to have the ability to evoke laughter. A comedy cannot be such that the reader or the spectator only smiles. He has to laugh. When you watch a comedy, when you read a comedy, there has to be an element of laughter. And as one critic put it beautifully, love gilds the scene and woman guides the plot. In comparison to a tragedy, I'll talk about it again, in comparison to a tragedy, comedy has women characters also with equal importance. Because if you think of all the tragedies of Shakespeare, for example, the protagonist, the important character, is always a male. In contrast, when we think of the comedies of Shakespeare, you would notice that what Ruskin said of Shakespeare's plays, Shakespeare has no heroes, only heroines, I think applies to the comedies of Shakespeare, never to the tragedies. So my dear students, remember that you must have all this for the writer to be able to evoke laughter, to make the reader appreciate what a good comedy is all about. What else does the writer need to do? I said he has to evoke laughter. How is this laughter evoked? Number one, it could be a physical deformity, which is in the lower kind of comedy. It could be incongruity, two things existing which cannot coexist. It could be mental deformity, or it could be obsession. Remember, if you don't tread the middle path, it can cause comedy. It can cause laughter. An obsession with anything. It could be with a person. It could be with an idea. It could be with a color. It could be with an action. Somebody wanting to do that all the time. That could evoke laughter. What else do we find in comedy? You've got amusing situations. you've got ridiculous or awkward manners. People's behavior, if they are ridiculous, if somebody bends too low, if somebody is always joining his hands in pranam, if somebody is always saluting, if somebody is always combing his hair, if somebody is always playing with his watch or with his tie, all this could be awkward, could be ridiculous. The dialogues can cause laughter, and there could be farcical caricatures. Caricature. A cartoon. A cartoon, somebody with a long nose has a much too long nose. So also there is a caricature. And sometimes in comedy, the writer is able to create caricatures. That is, they are no longer human, because a particular quality or a particular facial expression or a particular feature is exaggerated to such an extent that the moment he arrives on the scene, you feel like laughing. Think of some of the movies. I'm thinking of the very old movies of Laurel and Hardy. If they are on the scene, you cannot but laugh. So that is also a way in which comedy can be evoked. Let me now move on, my dear students, to the language of comedy. What is the kind of language that a writer needs to use? Remember, whenever we talk of tragedy, because remember, the tragic heroes are all either kings or nobles or great people, people from the high society, from the upper classes, and therefore the kind of language that they would speak would also be a kind of high language. When we think of the comedy as a form of drama, when we think of the kind of language that is used, we must remember that the writer needs to use language in such a way that he is able to evoke laughter in the reader or in the spectator. So number one, we could have comic juxtaposition. As I mentioned earlier in passing, you have one word which is total slang and the other word which is intellectual. These two words never go together, my dear students, but when they are put together in dialogue, automatically you laugh because it is so incongruous a situation. There is a comic juxtaposition. Comedy, language. It could also be deflation. And by deflation, what I mean is somebody who is expected to use good language is not able to use it. It could be, for example, and please don't laugh, it could be a teacher of English using wrong English. That would be terrible. That would be a kind of deflation. You cannot have a teacher of language mispronouncing a word in that language. I'm speaking to you in English. I could mispronounce a Punjabi word, but I should not be mispronouncing an English word. You get my point? And that is why it could be deflation. It could be diminution. What does that mean? He could reduce something which is very important, something which is very high, and make it very ridiculous and show how faulty that kind of language usage is. That could also evoke laughter. There could be exaggeration, which is the opposite of diminution. Diminution is making small of something which is big. And what is exaggeration? The exact opposite of that. You've probably heard the figure of speech hyperbole, hyperbole, as some say, and hyperbole. If you know what that is, it is speaking using much more words. Somebody has a thorn prick and you say, she shed a bucket of tears, right? That is hyperbole. That is exaggeration. To go back to movies, you can think of somebody like Charlie Chaplin. The way he walked, the way he limped, the kind of trousers that he wore, and he walked onto the stage. That is a kind of way of evoking laughter. I'm using the word language, my dear students, in a much larger sense. By language, I do not mean only the spoken word. I do not mean only language in that sense. I also mean the body language, which is very important. Because if somebody walks in like a pompous man and he's a very small man, when he pretends to be what he is not, right? Even that is a kind of language. I'm using language in that larger sense. Another way in which comedy can be evoked is by the grotesqueness of either characters, of situations, and you understand the word grotesque. Grotesque would be somebody who's maybe 8 feet tall, who's maybe got 3 heads. Naturally, since it is not true to life, we would consider it to be very grotesque. But even this could evoke laughter. Let's look at some of the other characteristics by which comedy, the comic effect, is achieved. We are looking at some of the ways in which this could be evoked. And here I'm talking about humor, inflation, invective, irony, incongruity. I'm going to quickly go through all this because remember, all this is an extension of what I've been saying previously to you. In the previous slide, you noticed. And this is an extension of all that. So I would like to move on to what now I'm going to talk to you about, which is actual language. And here when I talk about language, my dear students, I'm talking about language in the sense in which we use it in the classroom. And remember, I mentioned to you that I will be talking about Mrs. Malaprop again. And here I come to malapropism. The way in which a writer uses language, and here we are talking about the English language, and we are thinking of a playwright called Sheridan, and in his well-known play, he has a character called Mrs. Malaprop. And what does she do? She uses language in such a way, she uses a word which is very close to the actual word. For example, I'm sure all of you, my dear students of English language and literature, you certainly do know the word legible and you know the word eligible. You have a legible handwriting. That means I can read your handwriting. And you have an eligible bachelor. That means he's ready for marriage. And many mothers would like their daughters to marry him. Eligible and legible. At one instance, the two words seem to be alike. Very close in spelling, but of course with some difference. And if somebody talks about a legible bachelor or an eligible handwriting, it creates laughter. And this is what Mrs. Malaprop does all through the play. And so you have people in fits of laughter because you know that she's using a word which sounds the same but which is very, very different. So writers use this distortion of the usage of word, using a wrong word, a word which sounds like the other one but is not actually the same. It could also be encomium, where you pretend to praise a person when you are actually blaming him, her. Remember, this is one way of evoking comedy. Somebody comes very late and you don't say how late you are because that's not comedy, but you say how early you are, and then everybody else on the stage sort of sniggers or smiles, gives a wry smile. That is a way of creating comedy. All these are ways in which the writer uses language in order to create comedy on stage or even when you read it. It could also be by the use of, remember, jargon. If you have a doctor or a lawyer all the time using either medical language or the language of law, the language of courts, even that could create laughter. Comedy is also created by surprise. It could be created by understatement, the opposite of hyperbole, by wit, by satire, the juvenile kind of satire, or the Horatian kind of satire. I have been talking to you about how laughter is evoked. I'm talking to you about how comedy can be created by the writer so that he has the reader or the spectator laughing, enjoying the play. But I think, my dear students, it's very important to remember that when we think of drama as a literary form, when we think of drama as a genre, we have to remember that there was a phrase with which probably some of you are familiar, and the phrase is closet drama. Closet is not a word which we use very often today, but closet actually means a cupboard. The word that we use today is cupboard. So can I call it cupboard drama? And what do I mean by that? It means drama which is meant to be read and not to be acted. I want you to understand this very clearly. Generally, the true effect of a play comes across to us when we see it being performed. But as students of literature, most of you are only going to be seeing these plays as closet drama. What do I mean by that? You are only going to read it, or it is going to be read to you, or it is going to be explained to you. So very often, many of us who read drama may not get the full import of the play, the full effect of the play that we would be able to get if we were actually watching it. You know, drama can be best appreciated when it is seen, but it's not always possible. But students of literature, do try and see if you can get to seeing the plays. You know, you can see it in a movie form, or if some plays are being enacted somewhere, you should take this opportunity to go and view it, because seeing a play is always the best way to enjoy a play. And now I would like to take you to the types of comedy. Remember, we have to think of exams. And when we think of exams, we begin with what we call the definition of a comedy, which I've attempted to give you. What are the characteristics of comedy? I've attempted to give that to you. Though I've called it language of comedy, I've called it ways to evoke comedy. But yet what we really mean is, what are the features? What are the characteristics? What are the parts that a comedy has? Like you do when we talk about tragedy, we go to Aristotle and his famous definition of tragedy. Unfortunately, we do not have such a clear definition of comedy. But this is what I have attempted to do over the last half hour, 30 minutes. And now I'm going on to probably another question for you, an important question. What are the important types of comedy, kinds of comedy? Let's very quickly look at some of them. What we attempt to do in these lectures is to give you an idea of what it all is about. But then remember, you will have to go back to your library, you will have to go back to your textbooks, you will have to go back to your lectures, to your teachers, and talk about these. Once you get an idea what it all is about, you know what to look for. And that is what we attempt to do in these lectures. They set you on the right path towards reading more, understanding more, and probably writing better assignments, better exam papers. So let's go on to types of comedy. You have the burlesque, which is when other works of art are taken. For example, there's a very well-known play. If I think of The Good-Natured Man, if I think of Wall Porn, right? If I think of any of the well-known plays, if I think of The Way of the World, or even if I take a Shakespearean romance like All's Well That Ends Well or Twelfth Night, any of the comedies. And you know, you use another word in movies when we talk about it. The word is spoof. So a burlesque is like a spoof. That is, you take a well-known play and you write a play making fun of the earlier play. So probably you have the same characters, you have the same themes, but you are making fun of, either by lampooning it, either by exaggerating it, either by underplaying it, overstatement, understatement, what have you, then you call it a burlesque. Another kind of comedy is satire. Remember, satire can be the kind of satire that Swift had when he wrote his Gulliver's Travels. Satire can be the kind of satire that Addison and Steele had. Satire can also be the kind of satire that you find in the comedy of manners, or you find in the comedy of humors, where things are exaggerated to such an extent that they evoke laughter. There is a kind of drama, comedy, that is referred to as domestic, which means it is within the family. It deals with the home and the hearth. The outside world is totally absent. You have the comedy of ideas, my dear students, which is important. And before that, the comedy of manners. When we think of the comedy of manners, we are thinking of Restoration period. We are thinking of Congreve. We are thinking of Sheridan. We are thinking of Oscar Wilde. We are thinking of all this which was written after the Restoration. Remember, when we talk about 1660, you'll have to go back to your history of literature to understand why that period is called the Restoration period. Because the king of England was restored to the throne after his stay in France. These dramatists came back with a lot of ideas from the French court, a lot of French culture, and they tried to imbibe that, to inculcate that in their plays, and that is what we call the comedy of manners or the comedy of wit. The comedy of ideas, I'm taking a big leap and I'm taking you to the 20th century, and I'm talking to you of a person like George Bernard Shaw. Comedy of ideas. If you really want to understand the plays of George Bernard Shaw, whether it's Arms and the Man or Apple Cart, whether it's widowers' houses, whatever that you are thinking of, remember, you must sometime attempt to read his prefaces too, because Shaw's plays are about serious ideas. Shaw was a great socialist, and he believed that through his plays he could get across his ideas. In addition to his plays, he also wrote prefaces to each of his plays. And if you really want to understand what his plays are all about, you must go and read that. I talked about the comedy of ideas here because I wanted to link it with the comedy of manners. Now I'll have to take you back to the Elizabethan age, where comedy as a literary form really saw its brightest moment in the writings of Shakespeare in his comedy, which we generally refer to as Shakespearean romance. You know, these stories had heroines and heroes, you had a lot of laughter, you had disguises, you had songs, you had the forest, you had the fool, you had A Midsummer Night's Dream, and you had Twelfth Night, and you had The Tempest, and you had All's Well That Ends Well, and you had the Comedy of Errors. I could go on and on because Shakespeare's comedies are probably not as great as his tragedies, but yet a very important part of English literature. Read at least one or two of them. And if you can't read the plays, my dear students, do go back and read Tales from Shakespeare by Charles and Mary Lamb. I think one of the best ways in which Shakespearean plays have been condensed for us, written in very simple language in the Romantic age by this great personal essayist Charles Lamb. I think you should read that to understand and enjoy the themes of Shakespeare's comedies as well as tragedies. Let's go on to comedy of humors, because when I'm talking of the Elizabethan age, after Shakespeare, the next name that comes to mind is of course Johnson. I'm talking about Ben Jonson, not to be confused with Dr. Johnson and Boswell. Remember Boswell's famous biography of Johnson, Life of Dr. Johnson. Not to be confused with the Dr. Johnson who gave us the first English dictionary. I'm talking about Ben Jonson of the Elizabethan age. And remember, every man in his humour, every man out of his humour. Remember Walpole, remember Bartholomew Fair. What are all these books? The books that we are talking about, the plays that we are talking about, were all based on one Elizabethan theory, which said that there are humours. Now humours are the fluids, not to be confused with the other humour which evokes laughter, but it's a reference to the fluids in the human body, bile and colour. These humours, according to science of the Elizabethan age, gave us our respective character, our nature. If somebody had too much of phlegm, he was phlegmatic. If somebody had too much of choler, he was choleric. So these characters are exaggerated by a particular quality, by a particular characteristic, by a particular feature of their nature. And this caused the comedy. We move on 100 years and we come to the Restoration comedy. Now in the Restoration comedy, the important kind of comedy is the comedy of manners. You have to read The Way of the World, and probably it's prescribed for some of you, to understand how wit, how language, how unusual occurrences, inappropriate moments causes comedy. Read Way of the World, read the School for Scandal in order to understand what is actually happening in the comedy of manners. The sentimental and the anti-sentimental comedy lasted for a very short period. And the name which comes to mind naturally is Oliver Goldsmith. It caused laughter, but in that laughter were tears also. And that is why we refer to it as the sentimental comedy. Very quickly, I want to talk about another kind of comedy, the farce. People would like to keep the farce away from comedy and say, no, it's not a part of comedy. It's not a kind of comedy. But there are other critics of drama who would tell you, no, farce is also a kind of comedy. Generally, the farce is considered to be much lower, and therefore there are people who would not like to consider it to be a part of comedy as a literary form. I wanted to bring to you the difference between the tragic and the comic vision and show how the two are so different. How the characters, you'll have to take a quick look through it, my dear students, to see how the themes, how the characters, how the dialogue, how the language, how the virtues, how the values, how the beliefs, how the attitudes, they are all different in the tragic and the comic version. We are running short of time, and therefore you'll have to have a quick look, because I would like to bring you to the comedy of today. So what I've attempted to do for you here is to show how the heroic qualities are important in tragedy, how it is important for the tragic protagonist to be a king or a nobleman at least, but how on the other side you would notice that this is not true in comedy. You would notice how in tragedy it is very important to have a theme, to have a story content in tragedy. But in comedy, that is not important. But comedy relies on something different from tragedy in order to have its effect. Let me bring you to today. When I talk of today, I'm talking of the 20th century and, of course, the beginnings of the 21st century, because we've just finished one decade in the 21st century. And so it's very difficult to talk about the literature of the 21st century. But we can certainly see that the 21st century is an extension of the 20th century. What happened to English comedy? Comedy as a literary form, comedy as a part of drama in the 20th century. Let us look at some of the important contributors and contributions of this century. We must talk about the Auden group. Critics have referred to them as the Auden group because W.H. Auden, the famous poet, and three more people together, Louis MacNeice, remember the war poet, Stephen Spender, whose poem probably The Strain, you know. These writers came together and did some plays together. They produced the plays together, they wrote the plays together, and therefore their group and the kind of drama that they wrote was called the group theatre. Let's look at Beckett and Brecht, and you probably know that what they wrote was called the theatre of the absurd. We called it the theatre of the absurd because if you take one play as an example and you think of Waiting for Godot, you know that they are waiting. They don't know who they are waiting for. They don't know why they are waiting. They don't know when the person will come. They do not know whether the person will ever come. And therefore, it is called the theatre of the absurd, based on the existential idea that nothing really happens in life, that nothing is of importance, that we are all just existing. You had this kind of comedy. I want to talk about Noel Coward because his contribution to English drama of the 20th century is very important. He wrote about 50 plays, and his plays were very, very popular on the stage. He was closely associated with the movies as well as the stage, and his contribution is important. Another contribution is by writers who, like Pinter, for example, who talked about the injustices of society. And I have talked of them as the angry young man, because these protagonists were unhappy, were angry with the kind of life they were forced to live. And in their comedy, you see this happening. Look Back in Anger is a play that you might like to go back and watch. The women dramatists of this period, unfortunately, have not got the kind of recognition Their plays have not been performed as much as the male playwrights of this period. But you might like to go back and look at people like Pam Gams, Sarah Daniels, Sarah Khanna, etc. The arrival of television as a popular form of entertainment did have its effect on drama, on the theatre. And theatre in its turn had its effect on television. So between drama and television in the 20th century is a kind of give and take, that is, both received something and both gave back something. Another writer of this period, the 20th century, is Arnold Wesker. His most famous play is The Kitchen, and that is why some people refer to his plays as the kitchen sink drama, because he talks about the kitchen in a famous hotel and it deals with the waiters and waitresses there. Remember, I've already told you that in comedy, the characters don't have to be from rich upper class society. They are the common people with whom the reader or the spectator can very easily empathize, sympathize, understand, even when he is laughing at. My dear students, I've been talking to you about comedy as a literary form. Remember, we have to understand that drama is meant to be seen. We have to understand that tragedy and comedy are two different kinds of drama. In everything, they are different, except that they are both plays. Remember, the aim of tragedy is different from the aim of comedy. The themes are different, the characters are different, the language is different, the effect is different. And probably even the spectators or the readers who appreciate tragedy maybe do not appreciate comedy, and vice versa. But for you students who are attempting to understand comedy as a literary form, please remember that we have to look at the chief characteristics, features, and the growth and development of comedy. We need to do this so that you can understand how comedy is important as a literary genre today. I've attempted to take you to the beginnings, to take you to Greece and the village revelry, and bring you up to the 20th century with a quick look at the kinds of comedy that have been written in the English language. Because naturally, as students of English literature, what you are looking at is comedy as a literary form with special reference to the comedy that is written in the English language. And most of it that I've been talking about is comedy that has been written in Great Britain, that is written in UK. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture, and I hope I have been able to inspire you to go back and at least look up some of these names, some of these plays, maybe watch some of them, maybe read some of them, maybe act in some of them, enact some of them in your college programs, and enjoy comedy as a literary form.
SANDHAN, All Gujarat Integrated Classroom.
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.